But man, I was just watching some of your. I mean, I watched a few bits of different videos over the past couple weeks, but I started watching one of the longest videos you have on your channel with the magic as, I forget what the title of it was. It's like the magical history of modernity or something like that.
Yeah. What were your thoughts?
I appreciate your touching on that word, because I've been thinking about magic a little bit, or just like the place of like what's magic as a useful concept recently, and like, well, and even trying to parse out the difference between magic and religion too, because especially within Christian circles, magic is kind of a touchy issue of like, that's like the bad stuff.
Yeah, no, like it's really interesting. I suppose I'm thinking about the exact same thing. I've been thinking about it for a while because I got really interested in the Western esoteric tradition, Hermeticism and alchemy. And I mainly got into that through reading Carl Jung, who took all of that stuff really seriously.
Yeah.
And it was, let me just say, it was enchanting. Like, it was like really like, like enchanting might be the word.
That's honestly, that's a word I've really latched onto recently, because it feels like that's fundamentally one of the things we're so sort of hungry for in a world that's progressively kind of materializing everything, or like I forget. I think JP wrote an article not too long ago called like the solidification of everything. It's like the idea of just like everything breaking down to its least meaningful sense, and then it's like, I don't know. There's such a I mean, that's whoever coined. I think it must have been Vervaeke who came up with that term, the meaning crisis, right? It's like, is magic? Magic is almost sort of meaning.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, Max Weber, like early 20th century, I think he's like a sociologist. He had this term like the disenchantment thesis, I think he called it, which is like how modernity, how like rationalization, it's just what you described, like how the processes of rationalization kind of like de-soul everything, I guess, like take the spirit out of everything. And I guess that's connected to all the different processes of modernity, like science trying to like break things down to like the first principles and stuff, like a materialistic vision.
So what, I mean, sorry, if you have something that you want to, I'm interested in, because I haven't really read or listened to much, other than I think I listened to one Terence McKenna lecture about Hermeticism a little bit, but that was like one of that, and Peterson's Maps of Meaning is like the only place I've ever heard of this stuff. Like there's literally nobody in any of my circles that has ever talked about Hermeticism before.
Yeah. Well, it's esoteric, right? For a reason. Like it's supposed to be like hidden, like secretive knowledge. And so
it has to do with a hermit. Okay, is that what you're about to get into?
Well, like the weird thing about even studying it, quick proviso, just to tie off that magic thing we were talking about. I think part of the danger, I really want to discuss it, but part of the danger, like I guess from a Christian perspective, like how I'm currently thinking of it, is that because it is enchanting, and like we kind of like yearn for that enchantment, and like it is because it's like magical theories basically. I think there's something kind of dangerous about that, kind of like a playing with fire kind of thing. Maybe we could discuss later, but like the more I looked into it, I was like, it's really, really enchanting. Really, this magical vision of the world is so amazing that people a few hundred years ago thought this way. Like there was a magician called John Dee who was at the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and he read her stars, like, and he did like he like made maps and compasses, and so he was like he was bridging the worlds of like science and magic, like in the late 16th century. So,
well, I guess is the danger with sort of beginning to see, cohesive form to things, is that you begin to sort of read that pattern on. I mean, it becomes like kind of a sort of apophenia, which is like reading patterns into or forms into things that aren't really there. When you're in the shower and it's like you can think you hear the phone ringing because you've actually somehow managed to perceive that pattern in the white noise of the shower noise. You get so fixated on looking for particular patterns that you see them in places that it's maybe not useful to see them.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps part of it. I think there's also something about tradition, like the absence of tradition or something like that. There's something quite like wild about it, like especially alchemy. Um, you've got to imagine like during the Middle Ages, like just people studying alchemy in secret, like working like to like pour these metals down, but like the church would persecute magic, and like so
Right.
they would
Okay.
have these like scripts and these theories about the transformation of nature, and so there's like a very underground element to it through the whole basically like 2,000 years of it. Um,
So it's almost
so
like, what would you say? Like it's almost like conspiracy theorists or something. It's like people who are very paranoid about the system. It's like, okay, well, there's actually some truth under here, but it's being suppressed, and we need to, but we can't let this be public that we're doing this. We need to try and it's like a secret order of people trying to crack the code.
yeah, no, that's exactly it. Um, and actually, like the Royal Society, like and Newton, and like when science was starting to establish itself, that was all connected with
Yeah,
like
because
the
Newton was an
Rosicrucian.
alchemist, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, just a very interesting
It's a funny piece of
fact.
history because like we think of Newton as like this important figure in the history of science, but for like just try to ignore the fact that he's connected to this totally other tradition that we're really uncomfortable with.
Yeah, no, like that's so there's all of this stuff really is what I guess captured my interest, right? Like the fact, like it's just the fact that Newton wrote like 80% of his works were alchemical manuscripts, like, and it's like, what do we do? It's like, what do we do with that? Like, what do we
Yeah.
actually do with that? With the image of Newton, who is like the paradigm of like rationality and science in the collective imagination. Like, what do we do with that?
Yeah.
So it drove me to understand it all.
Well,
Um,
could you even explain a little bit more technically, or just so I can have a better frame of reference? Because I mean, I've started to at least come across random things having to do with alchemy or hermeticism, but I don't think I know technically what either one of those words means or where they come from.
yeah. So it's complicated. Um, alchemy is like it's like um, basically it's connected to Egypt. It's connected. Hermeticism is connected to the Greek culture, the Greek syncretism of like the first few hundred years of like the first millennium. Like you had all these like traditions, like the Roman and Greek and Christian, Jewish, like traditions in Alexandria, for instance, in Egypt. Like you had all this syncretism, basically, like this cross fertilization of all these different ideas.
Hmm.
And what happened is like I think it's like Alexander the Great. I think my history is not great. I think it's like the Suclid Empire or something. Like Alexander the Great's colonization, basically expansion of Greece. He took over Egypt and planted Alexandria. And what happened was the Greeks had this figure in their pantheon called Hermes, um, who was like a psychopomp who would like move between the like realm of the gods and our world, and he was like a
Okay.
messenger. It's like he had like the winged feet, right? He like flies
He's the
between.
mediator between heaven and earth.
That is exactly what he is, yeah. And so what the Greeks realized is as they looked at Egypt, which is really the mother culture to Greece in many ways, it's like a much older culture just south of Greece. Like the Greeks kind of like saw in the Egyptian pantheon this deity called Thoth, who is like the scribe god, and Thoth is credited with like the development of script, words, language, communication, and so
Okay.
there was a kind of um, like a mapping of Hermes and Thoth, like a syncretism, and Thoth Hermes became this mythical figure called Hermes Trismegistus, which sounds really magical.
Okay.
Who's like the, I'm describing the mythos of Hermeticism and alchemy, but that figure is really at the heart of it. And the idea is that this is what Newton thought, was that like in the beginning, a sacred knowledge was handed down. And now I'm thinking of this in terms of the Christian stories as I tell this, so it's really interesting. But like a sacred knowledge was handed down to Thoth Hermes, and that knowledge had been preserved through the generations, like through every generation. This kind of like occult or esoteric hidden knowledge had been preserved through all these different generations. And I think the word for that was the Prisca Sapientia, or the Prisca Theologia, like the pristine knowledge or the pristine theology. And so
you said
Newton
that has to do with sorry, I'm jumping over to the video you were talking about with Egypt having some association with that term as well. But sorry, you wanted to do Newton first. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, it's just that this idea was in Newton's mind, but it's quite an interesting thing to consider. Like when he, with his discoveries around light and gravity, like one of his faiths, I guess, like what part of his vision was like the search for the Prisca Sapientia, like the pristine knowledge.
So can you explain a little bit more of what
the content of that might be?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was their idea of this concept of this pristine knowledge? It's like that's the idea of like the real forms of things.
Yeah. So like that's how I understand it. So figures like Pythagoras, for example, or Plato, really, like who had these. Like the more I even study the Greeks, I'm reading a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom, which looks at some of the pre-Socratics, but like they had a whole, how can I say it, like a visionary culture, or culture of like a mystery culture, I guess, where as Greek philosophy emerges, which is like the foundation of a lot of Western culture, like what is there is figures who have these intuitions, I guess, like Plato's cave is like kind of the basis of a lot of our metaphysics, like Pythagoras' ideas about numbers, and just lots of people throughout history. And let me just quickly connect this to that alchemical stuff, because there's a whole story about alchemy. Alchemy in the popular imagination is central to it is transformation. Okay, that's why I guess I'm so interested in it, because it's about transformation, the transformation of what is base, lower, and fallen, like lead. The metal lead was a symbol for that, into what is noble, pure, refined, and perfected. Like that is the simple vision of alchemy.
Right. Or like try to turn everything into gold, which that's what I remember anyways of Maps of Meanings talking about what alchemy is about, is that it's just trying to figure out how to turn stuff into gold.
That's it.
But as far as like conceptually, it's like, so like what you just said is just turning everything into sort of their valuable form or their most meaningful form, or like the version of themselves that they ought to be, almost, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a good way of putting it, like how they ought to be. Kind of like their telos, I guess, or like the aim, or like the logos, like the thing towards which nature is aiming. Like in the alchemical imagination.
Both of those terms are probably worth though explaining real quick too, as we're walking through this. So telos and what did you say after telos?
Logos.
Yes. So, okay.
Both, telos I just think of as like aim, or the other one is like end, like that towards which a process is directed. Mm-hmm. And so in the alchemical vision, like the whole of nature has as its telos perfection. It's just that, in the magical vision,
just like, as I'm thinking about this right now, did the alchemists or the hermeticists, is that the right word, hermeticists, hermits?
Yeah.
Did they see that as sort of like a static state of like like it's like we need to return to this. Like, I mean, thinking about it in terms of being gold, and maybe this is just kind of reading too much of like a modern mechanistic understanding of gold into it. Is it like they? Because if you think about wanting to turn everything literally into gold, it's like, okay, you want to turn everything into this, like that's the King Midas story. It's quite a sad or like scary story of turning everything into gold. You don't want everything to be literal gold. But so did they see gold as sort of a static thing? Right?
So there's a medieval thing about like hermeneutics of Christianity. So like
is it hermeneutics? Is that actually comes from Hermeticism or Hermes?
Yeah, like in the interpretation, right? Like
oh right, okay, yeah. So it's still like that god of mediating between the higher theology or like the godlike concepts into it's okay. I never understood hermeneutics that way.
Yeah, but like like the medieval scholastics would like there'd be like a literal plane of reading the Bible, an allegorical, an anagogical. I'm throwing out lots of words. Basically, there's a literal and a symbolic plane of interpretation when reading scripture, according to a lot of the medieval scholastics. And it's the same actually with alchemy, which is what Carl Jung really focused in on, is he basically would say like, look, let's not think about alchemy in terms of the literal transformation of like this metal lead into gold.
Right.
But, he saw it as a transmutation of the soul, basically. Okay, like the psyche, the inner life of the alchemist was undergoing a process whilst throwing off all of these symbols and images about describing all of this alchemical language. And so in their manuscripts, in their art, in the work of alchemy, let's say, for Jung, was content of the unconscious. So like there was like a real natural expression of like what was happening in what Jung would call the psyche, like what was happening within. So that's like all of this stuff really interested me. Like even as an idea, like it's so
well, it's interesting hearing you talking about the idea of it actually being about both, like, I mean, as far as in terms of reading the Bible as well, but it's like, okay, so when it comes to talking about that process of turning things into gold, it's not just the like, so obviously Carl Jung kind of introduced the idea that, okay, this is about something more abstract as well, but it was also actually about trying to turn stuff into gold, and is the intuition that the process by which things are turned into a different state of being, that's the same process somehow on a chemical or chemistry level as a metaphysical level?
Yeah, I think that is the intuition. Yeah, and that's another image in Hermeticism and alchemy is the model of the macrocosmos above and the microcosmos below, which again I found in Christian tradition, which was super interesting. But like the idea that there is a correspondence between the heavens and earth, and so like if we truly see that, then the transformations of, say, like the zodiac as that moves, like in this as people look up into the stars as that moves, so there is a movement within our own hearts, within our own lives, and there are like analogies or sympathies between what is above and what is below. Like this is like basically the central maxim of alchemy. Actually, is like as above, so below. Like that is kind of the basis to the magical understanding too. Is that by bringing Earth into conformity with heaven, power is drawn down or something like that.
Does it flip around both ways though? Like that we sort of gain insight about the heavenly ideas by looking lower?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's ontologically is really connected to the idea that all being in nature is linked by some mysterious quintessence. Like
is that sort of the idea of archetypes really fit into that idea as well, right? Or at least the way I've been thinking about them is maybe we're jumping way too far forward, but I mean the idea that that there's particular relationships between things that will just sort of pop up no matter what level you contemplate the system of reality. Or like sort of patterns of behavior that is just like they're inevitable because that's just the way things most efficiently or most elegantly, I don't know, like it's the way reality sort of settles.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Because you were doing a video talking about chess a little while ago, and I found that to be a really interesting, at least trying to think about that idea in terms of it, because chess is a little bit simpler of a system, but yet there's still, I don't know how many 100,000 possibilities there are for different games of chess, but it's like
more than stars in the universe.
Yeah, it's approaching the infinite. It's beyond comprehension, anyways. But despite all of those potential games and potential places a game could go, there's certain patterns that tend to emerge of even like kind of key strategies, and there's plenty of books written about how to identify these patterns and how to use them effectively. But like even some really simple ones is just like the idea of like the fork, like taking two pieces with a knife, and it's like there's a lot of situations where that if you can grasp that concept as a strategic pattern, you can use it in a lot of really, really important ways, or like maybe different openings and things like that. It's like those, to me, that sort of clicked as like, that's almost like the same thing as like an archetype. It's like, it's a pattern of behavior that emerges whenever it's like you establish a system of rules, and then suddenly there's these certain ways of being in that system that are just really, again, it's just reality kind of settles into these patterns.
Yeah, what's so interesting about chess as an example too is that you can have the idea of a fork, or like the different tactics, the different principles, which is like a real body of like established knowledge, like like get the center and all of these things. But then like when you listen to Magnus Carlsen, who's the current basically the world's best at the moment, he's so interesting to listen to because he just is for him, like there's a really interesting interview by him where like someone's like asking him about his chess game, and he's just saying like, look, I find these questions really hard to answer because at some point it just becomes very intuitive. And like, what does that mean? But that means that means that like that fork you were talking about, that principle there, like the logos of chess have kind of like somehow become part of his active logos or something.
Or I even wonder if it's latched on to some deeper process about the way that life works, and they've sort of meshed into each other, and like this intuitive process of recognizing patterns has overlapped now with his chess abilities.
Well, intuition is like it's a huge,
such a massive,
mystery.
Crazy idea.
It's a crazy idea, and yet it's so central to like his performance in chess, or just basically everything we do in life. Like so much of what we do in life, and the interesting thing about it is because Magnus Carlsen faces novel chess games. Like he faces novel chess games that are patterned, as you say, like he'll recognize situations, but on the level of like emergence, might we say, like novelty, like it is a new game, like because there are infinite games, so he'll be entering completely new, fresh game that no chess player has ever played before.
Right.
But then finding the right moves through that situation, and I do think it is deeply analogous to life. Like I think every day is fresh in that sense, like every situation is novel in that sense, and even like our paths through life, like no one's lived mine or yours lives before. Like human beings have lived, and there's been paths,
but they haven't lived this particular moment every time. So it's always that. Yeah, there's always a particular. But then even within the particularity of that moment, you can, again, if this intuition is right, you can sort of recognize patterns of, okay, this goes here, and now I understand that this is a day, and this is a particular hour, and in this hour I should be eating lunch. Right? You used the word a second ago, logos. That's thrown around a lot in some of the communities you and I have both been following, but I don't I mean, I know recently you've been reading, I think, some of Saint Maximus the Confessor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I that name's been thrown around a little bit too, and I'm like, okay, I've got to listen to this guy at some point. This sounds like some great stuff, but I haven't at all. Can you break down a little bit of the meaning of logos a little bit more clearly as far as what you're doing with it?
Yeah, I can try. I'm still trying to understand. Like, I'm reading to understand. Like, I don't know what my expertise on that, I guess. But look, I think of it in terms of hierarchy. Like Aristotle talked about the ladder of nature, like how that there is a mineral plane, a vegetable plane, an animal plane, and the plane of humans. Like that in nature, there is a kind of ontological hierarchy or like chain of being, and that's kind of the best way. That's the best kind of model I have for understanding what logos means, because logos means a lot of things, but one of the ways we can use it is like the unique. Another word would be intellect, but intellect in the broad sense of capacity to be creative, perhaps the capacity to inform structures or something like that, like the creation of beauty, or truth with our language, like, or with chess, like that is you are like informing how the game goes. Kind of, it's like basically like the unique character of human intelligence, I guess.
Well,
and that's
okay.
a whole. Yeah.
Does it play into, so one thing I've been thinking about recently and having some back and forth with some people on some subreddits about the idea of thingness having to do with perception. I mean, this kind of goes into the if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it make a sound, right? Because a sound is something. It seems like it could just be sort of a language trick, because it's like did it make a sound? Well, a sound is something that you hear, and it's like there was the potentiality for sound, but it becomes the particular thing of sound when somebody is hearing it with an ear. Sound has to do with hearing and with ears and with that ability to process sound. But so if we kind of take all of that for granted, that like anything being a particular thing has to do with a particular observer seeing it as doing a particular thing, and that has to be associated with, like, we talked about telos. So it's like if I am trying to do something and I don't even necessarily know what I'm trying to do particularly, but I have some sort of aim, and for some reason that seems to be relevant to that aim, I can perceive it as a thing because it's relevant to my aim, right? Are we on the same page so far?
Yeah.
So,
like, meaning is contextualized by the narrative or like story or something where you're going.
So
what's relevant is.
So if and this kind of goes into this idea of at least I've been thinking about the concept of panpsychism and talking about that with a few friends. The idea of consciousness not being something that's totally unique to human perception, but that basically humans just have more potential to see more uses or more different potential thingness to things than like a plant per se. So like a plant's perception of reality is a much simpler perception than my perception, and the plant is only going to recognize far fewer things that are relevant to sort of its telos. But because my telos, my aim in life, again, I don't really know exactly what my aim in life is, right? We don't, as humans, it's not totally clear what we're doing on Earth, but we have like
it's not clear. I mean, St. Maximus's answer, as it's fresh in my mind, is literally like your aim is to recognize your aim or something like that. Like the logos.
Is the logos just all of the potentiality, or like being able to recognize all of the potentiality of everything, every possible things? Looking at all of,
like,
all
why,
of the...
why do we have the unique consciousness we have? Like, we don't necessarily know the answer to that question, okay? But we do intuitively have the sense that we do have some kind of unique consciousness that's different from animals and plants.
Yeah.
So why? And like St. Maximus's answer is kind of like this is part of the creation, like this is part of the divine plan, is for human beings to be imbued with a logos. And he kind of conceptualizes sin as like the use of that logos as like in any direction that, I hope I'm explaining this all right. It's hard stuff.
But is so
any
logos
direction
is the meaning of it? I'm still not. I can't totally follow what that word is talking about.
Like, look, it is hard because it feels like it's the thing that's perceiving and the thing that's perceived. So the logoi are like you could say forms. So like, I see Garrett on the screen, right? Like that's like an identity. Mm-hmm. And you're sitting on a chair, that's another identity. So those are the logoi in my perceptual field. Mm-hmm. And I'm able to recognize those things somehow, and we even have words for them, and which is connected to Adam's first task in Genesis being to name the animals, is connected to the logoi, like the like crystallization of the patterns of things and the seeing of what they are in essence.
So
there's
it does have to do with meaning, or at least the way you're saying that helps me. That clarifies it a little bit. Sorry, you continue. I wasn't trying to interrupt you. Well, I think we have a little delay here, so sometimes I'm not really meaning to interrupt your talking, but it sounds like you just stopped.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah, so like it is confusing because I think in some sense, logos is a word that can mean like the things that we are perceiving, like chair, Garrett, microphone, like these things and the words and identities like we have.
Because logos means word.
Right. And so like biology, which actually Aristotle pioneered, and Aristotle's kind of important in all of this, but biology, if you look at like taxonomy, what is that? It's like mammals, kingdom, phyla, all of these different logoi. Mm-hmm. Like it's literally going around the world, like Darwin going to the Galapagos is just going around the world, like going, okay, that's that. So biology, like, and so there's a way in which like human understanding proceeds according to this pattern. Like we increase in our knowledge according to our ability to grasp the logoi. But then another sense is like that's the thing that's doing that ordering, say, is human what I think the Greek fathers call it like intellect, or so there's a process by which that's happening, and that process is made in an image, the image of God. Like,
right. Okay. So following that same pattern though as before, it's like, okay, so particular thingness, or again, a particular logos or logoi, has to do with it, with the telos, the aim of the observer, right?
That's an interesting connection.
Because
yeah, I guess
if that's
so.
the case, then if sort of, and this is the thing that blew my mind. I was talking to JP recently, and we just kind of came on this thought that, hey, if there's an infinite being that that perceives all of reality and actually has a purpose for it, then that purpose is what creates like the real meaning, or like the most actual meaning for everything. And so it's like we have always a subjective logos, or subjective logos, subjective in particular definitions of things. And it's like, to the extent that our aim is kind of in line with that ultimate aim of what things are for, we will kind of recognize what actual things exist, or that we'll recognize them properly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the arguments that Maximus is making, is that everything is designed according to an order, to a pattern, and that basically it's a question of kind of alignment. Mm-hmm. And if if we use this word telos again, like aim, like where is, if you think of like attention as like the currency of our logos or something, like moment by moment, that's how the logos is being deployed or something.
Yeah.
And what it's being deployed to is like a telos, like it's like there's like a value structure behind that.
Right.
And I guess the way I'm thinking about it at the moment is that you can either look down the hierarchy, because like it is an ontological hierarchy, or you can look up the hierarchy towards the source and towards the kind of fulfillment of all of the logoi.
Yeah.
That's how I'm currently thinking about it. And it connects to alchemy too, because part of my critique, I guess, of the alchemy stuff is, so I looked at like shamanism as well for a while because they're connected, but like there are, my point, like the alchemists are looking at metals, like their attention is going into the mineral plane, like it's like going down the ontological hierarchy, and the shaman will like invoke the spirit of the deer in like the hunt or something, like becoming the deer. So they're like going down from the human into the animal plane of consciousness. Now, you know, we can discuss whether there are consciousnesses down there, but there are definitely ancient cultures that believe that. And
well, that intuition makes sense to me anyways. It's just, it seems like a difference in degree, not necessarily in kind.
Yeah. I don't know. I think there might be a qualitative. Do you not think there's a qualitative difference between like the consciousness we have and the consciousness like
I've been thinking about this question a little bit recently too, and I think from a pragmatic perspective, it's useful. I think it's useful to say yes, but I think that, and this is a very abstract and philosophical intuition, and I'm not really sure if I've dug deep enough in it, or if I'll even be able to understand deeply enough to know whether or not I'm right or wrong here. But it seems to me that everything that could be considered a qualitative difference is just a large enough quantitative difference that it becomes useful to consider it something else. But
so unpack that a little bit.
So there's not necessarily a particular line between when a puddle becomes a river. There's a pragmatic line. There's not necessarily. Okay. I mean, we actually think of them as different things, and it is useful to think about them as different things because you can do different things with them. So again, the telos has to do with it again, right? So if I'm trying to find a place to house, 100 fish, I don't know, try to throw some fish in the water, I don't want to find a lake that's only 10 inches wide and an inch deep. That's not the object that I'm looking for. So pragmatically, I'm looking for a different thing. But
I see what you're saying.
So like there's a critical point where something becomes useful for something else, but that it's a critical point, but it's not an objective point, because maybe you could get a very small river that you could still fish could be in it for a little while. I mean, you could probably put a fish in a foot wide puddle of water, and it would be alive a little bit longer than if it wasn't in water at all.
I mean, this question's so fascinating, and something like. The ontological jump between quantity and quality, this is connected to the logos stuff we've been discussing too, right? Because another practical way of thinking about the logos, as I understand it, is how quality emerges out of quantity. I don't know, if you're buying a house, there's all these choice, like a field of choices are in front of you. It's actually how all choice happens in a strange way, but there's all these choices and they all have facts about them. This house is bigger, this house is smaller, this house has a garden, this house, all of these, there's an infinity of potential facts about the field of choices in front of you, right? And so it's plausible that you could spend eternity considering those facts. right? Weighing them up. Oh, but this does have not have that, and like, but that's not what happens, is it? Like somehow that stuff like collapses in, or like, I would say like kind of coheres or like comes together. This is another.
Right.
We were discussing recently with on the symbolic world about the meaning of the word symbol, like the way in which things are thrown
Casting
together.
together. Yeah.
So like, there's a way in which reality symbolizes or something, like it actually comes together in a meaningful way, and part of that is the activity of the logos in a practical sense. And then so actually this one particular house is where I want to live, because it really speaks to me, resonates to me, has a presence about it. And could you explain that factually? Could you say like, oh, it's
well, the question is whether or not you're actually doing, at some deeper level, you're actually doing a particular factual qualitative process of all these individual process of evaluation, and it's like you're actually processing all those facts, but it's kind of at a subconscious level, or if it's a totally different way of perceiving and of processing reality altogether, where it's not particular processes, but somehow a collective process that then somehow spits out a particular fact about it or a particular symbol.
Well, it's love, right? Well, that process.
Explain that.
Well, it is love, right? Like
it's
if you
love.
If you think, like, reflect on like the phenomenology of it, like in your experience, because it's not about like the flatness or the quantity. Like none of that is making the decision. Like the heart is moving towards something immensely, towards, we could say, a symbol that is intensely meaningful, something like that. Okay. And what is that movement towards that? Like in ancient language, it's like a desire to be in the presence of that thing, like a desire to enter communion with that thing, or that being, or whatsoever. Like there's a moving towards, like there's an active movement towards, to be in the presence of. And I think that is part of the structure of human being. And that's like, that example I was giving was like choice, but it's the same about how we meet partners, career choices. Like our whole life is like according to that pattern of love. So I'm starting to think that there is some truth in the idea that like love is at the basis of reality ontologically. Like at least if you take it the tree falls in the woods thing, like if you take the fact that to hear a sound of the tree, you have to have ears, you have to have this unique consciousness we have, then love does seem quite central to that. And like love and logos, both difficult.
Well, I'm not sure I'm totally on the same page as you just yet. So are you almost talking about the sense of like longing for something?
But we long, there's a pattern to it. Like there's like why are there classics in music, like Bach or Beethoven? Okay, right. Why are they remembered? Mm-hmm. Because, and again, it's the same infinity, the same quantity thing. If you tune into the music scene of anything, there's just infinite like novelty sprawling out there, like this kind of quantity, and yet they like stand out as these beacons, don't they? Like these classical beacons. And like why? Well, like traditional answer would be because they kind of are like vessels for like the beautiful, or like the form of the beautiful, and they like lead us into that. They draw us into that form, and they.
So how is that like love though?
So I mean, love is like a type of desire, but it's like a desire for the sublime or a desire for the transcendent. So
it's like the is it almost like the simple thing? It's like it's the unification of things, or they coming together into like a higher thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like, why do we love Beethoven and Bach? Because
I mean, it's easiest to see in just two humans who love each other. It's like, okay, within the Christian tradition, you see them becoming a new one person, right? Or then they become a family, which is one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's another great example, I think. And so I just see this connection between logos. Another word for it is like order or coherence, and then there's different types of order. There's like beauty, like Plato's classic transcendentals are the beautiful, the good, and the true. And so, like when you're reading a book and you're really engaged in it, it's like, oh, it's partaking in the form of the true. Like when you see a morally exemplary person, that person's partaking in the form of the good. Like, and the music is partaking in the form of the beautiful.
Yeah.
And like these are like, I think these are ways in which the telos, like the aim of a thing, is directed towards the logos, like it's perfection, it's like ultimate order. And that's got to be like an ever unfolding mystery, but I think those are glimpses of what that is. And then what love is like somehow like there's been in us, in our hearts, like seeded a desire to really deeply participate in that, like to participate in that,
but without becoming just an amalgamation of all of us or all things. Like it's not like this homeostasis desire to like just become one blob of everything, so everything loses its individuality, right? It's somehow a coherence of individual identity and corporate or corporeal meaning, that like it's like identity up here and down here and all the way up and down.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I heard you say with your right towards the end of your conversation with JP, I thought it was brilliant. Like you said about like language and how I think you were talking about church and like how we speak different languages. And I think it's basically the same idea you just said there. Like there's a way in which the transcendent forms have to be translated, would be a good word, into like a particular dialect, we could say, or something. And I think you're absolutely spot on with that. And yeah, I think that's
so the idea of like, because the thing I was a little afraid of is within this whole idea of logos being sort of ultimate meaning is that I'm getting back to that kind of picture of like turning everything into gold. It's like if it's just a static, everything just needs to like become just this high, huge form and sort of submit itself to becoming this statue of what the real meaning of things is. That's kind of a scary concept, and it seems kind of counterintuitive to everything that we would feel would be good. It's like, okay, if everything loses its thingness just so it can kind of submit to one high ultimate thing and become one monolith of like the real thing, that just see like you feel it in your gut when you think about that. It's like that's not what we're after, right? But I think,
well, isn't that the Christian theological vision of this? Is again like connecting the logos and love is like there's like a freedom of our will to choose otherwise, like to do a path other, or to do that path. And like,
but is it just a freedom, or is it an actual?
Well, they're both of those are aims, right? So like you aim away from the beautiful, or you aim towards it.
Yeah.
And that's a moment-to-moment choice. That's what classically was called our will. Our will is directed there or here. And I think that's getting at love. Like love is kind of aiming at the highest. And I don't know, for me, that's been a learning process. It's not necessarily self-evident. And like we aim at all sorts of things, don't we? Like, there's all these different passions and desires and things that motivate our being that have their own telos, that their own agenda, their own wills, basically. Mm-hmm. And they're pulling us into like, I guess, fragmentation or, chaos.
I've just had this, something just landed for me in my head. Because I really like music. I play a lot of music. My family tradition, my grandparents and parents traveled around playing music. And so I was kind of born into a tradition of playing a lot of music and thinking about music a lot. And so in recent years, I've started to pay attention to certain people, like try to break down music theory and stuff, and sometimes apply it to philosophy, which is always such a cool rabbit trail to go down, I find anyways. But one of the craziest things is that the idea, I mean, again, this kind of appeals to an intuitive pull again, but I think most people would agree if you were to say that harmony is more beautiful than unison. Harmony.
What's the difference between harmony and unison?
Okay, so two unison voices would just be singing the same note, exactly the same note, right?
Okay.
That's total uniformity. It's unison, right? Total unification, right? Harmony, I'm not even sure if you could break down the etymology. Maybe it has something to do with harm to each other. But the idea with harmony is that if you take the waveforms, they line up perfectly sometimes, and other times they don't. And the most generally pleasing type of harmony, or like the most commonly understood harmony that just shows up no matter what culture has kind of discovered music, I think is the perfect fifth, right? And that's this really great great mathematical relationship of 3/2, or approximately. It actually might be closer to this other mathematical concept, phi. Have you heard of phi? Okay.
No, I haven't.
I'm not an expert at all on this. I'm just kind of grasping at it, but it's just really even interesting to me. So I've been watching some videos and reading a couple different things about it. But it's this weird mathematical relationship that shows up all over the place, and one of the best ways of at least putting it into numbers, because it's not a specific. I think it's an irrational number, but there are fractions, ratios that kind of approach it. And that's the Fibonacci sequence is a great example of it. It's numbers that is there's these relationships in nature where it's like I know a few of the Fibonacci numbers. It's like 5/3 is one, 8/5, 13/8, but all of those cohere in almost the exact same way that that musical harmony. There's a similar hierarchy there. So most of the harmonic relationships that we find most pleasing are actually Fibonacci relationships, and a perfect fifth is actually a 3/2 polyrhythm. It's a Fibonacci relationship of 3/2, and so what that sounds like in rhythmic form is, so every 4 beats, every 4 times, so if you imagine them as wavelengths, every 4 times they're going to actually cohere exactly, but there's still this disagreement between them.
They'll have a unison technically every 4 times, right?
Exactly.
But
it's so this is the thing. So with harmony, we find this more interesting or more beautiful or more like, I think it's just, it's more beautiful because it's like there's uniformity and there's individuality, right? And that's what love is, right?
I love that. Like, music's such a mystery. Like, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that. Yeah, I've been producing a bit of like electronic music, and it's just like the waveforms and the patterns and the structures of it, and that harmony has been a massive theme for me as well. Just like in the way we order our lives, like I feel like harmony is one of those. The musical metaphor, I think, is super important because there's all these dynamic things like happening in our lives, like, and I feel like the way they come together in harmony feels like,
well, it feels like a very alchemical intuition to think that relationship between notes is somehow similar to the relationships between people and ultimately like God and man. But that that seems to be the intuition of the spiritually inclined.
Yeah, like I think music, that's where like it just dovetails into what we were talking about logos. Like music, that Fibonacci stuff you're talking about is like an order to it, right? It's like there's an order, but really like to create a new piece of fresh music is to not bring it. It's the same as with the chess stuff. It's like it has to be like a spontaneity, I guess is the word. Like it has to be freely willed or something.
Yeah.
Like like genuinely freely willed, and yet the most free will is like the coming into a harmony, the coming into like a a certain pattern. But yeah, you're right. I guess there is a danger about thinking about it in terms of like something that everyone, some like fixed
Like a
thing that
perfect
everyone has
coherence
to
or
follow.
perfect is it you? I don't know. There's different words you could use, but yeah, like a perfect absolute submission where everything becomes the same thing.
Hmm. Yeah, no. So this is why I've just been really fascinated to be. I've been like reading a lot of like the saints and trying to and scripture and trying to just I don't know understand Christianity more deeply. And I think one of the things super that's really compelling for me is this like profound cosmological vision like about the like the nature of human being, the nature of our wills, and how love is kind of central to it all, and what love means,
Right.
and the idea of the freedom of the will. Like, where did that idea even come from? Like, that was really interesting to me. Like, as part of like the zeitgeist of our culture, like, um, freedom of speech. Like, okay, but like, what? Like, freedom of speech? Why is that this thing we value? It's like, okay, because we value freedom of the will. Like, why do we value that? Just trying to dig into all of those things historically, and I think it does. It's connected to Christianity as far as I can tell, and I think there's a lot of like traditions that talk about the idea of the freedom of the will.
So what drew you? Because you didn't really set out on your journey through spiritualism and Jungian psychology and all this with the original intent of becoming a Christian, right? Or did you?
No, this is no, I really didn't. Like, I grew up. I don't know, we're quite secular in the UK, which means I didn't necessarily have a particular religious education. To be honest, I've slowly realised like I don't think I was particularly. It's a weird one. The reason I think beauty is such an interesting one for me is because like we have all these parish churches in the UK and these stained glass windows and like these beautiful buildings. They're like these ancient buildings and they're just all around the landscape. And like they speak of something, like they speak of like something truly profound. Um, and So there's like this beauty that was just enduring through my whole life. And I think like Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings rock played a similar role in my life. Like this like yearning for the transcendent, and like there were these things in the background, let's say. But like as I developed intellectually, I wasn't necessarily. I listened to some of the new atheist Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and stuff like that in my early 20s, and I guess yeah, it all started for me with an existential crisis, to be honest, like a genuine spiritual crisis in my early 20s. Um, and I mean that's comparable to what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. Like I was just a void, like it was just a complete void within
What
me.
got you there? Like,
Um, well, that's a good question. I guess I've been trying to figure that out ever since. Like my university education was coming to an end. I think there was an end of a story there, which was connected to it. Like I'd been in education like my whole life, and that narrative was coming to an end. And then I suppose what was underneath that narrative breaking down was like, who am I, kind of thing, which is I don't know, normal to people in their early 20s, I guess, trying to formulate an identity like, who am I? Like, what is it to me? Like, what is my story? Like, what do I value and stuff?
yeah.
And there was just nothing there. Like, there was just, where it was a mess, it was just, there was what Nietzsche called the abyss, right? Like, there was some kind of like, and
It's almost like our culture has handed us sort of a story that we're supposed to play out. Like we have like almost a religious tradition of like what it means to be a person, but the story is a really incomplete story that ends when you finish contributing to the primary economic systems that the culture wants you to participate in. So once you've finished getting a university degree, culture has digested you financially, and they're done. And so now what are you going to go and be? Well, suddenly that question is your question to ask, and not just what the culture wanted to do with you. Or at least from a capitalistic perspective. I'm very critical of that lately. I'm sure I'm probably painting it in a worse light in some ways than it should be, but my dad will probably kick my butt about that later.
No, I think that, yeah, I hear you. I hear you on it. I think it's, I don't know, like, it's a strange thing, like figuring out what our own story is. And I don't know if it's a particularly modern thing or not. I think that's something it could be archetypal, right? It could, and I probably leaned more towards that. Like every human being goes through some kind of crisis of meaning and a reconstitution of that crisis of meaning, even into ancient times. I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I guess it's not that unique to our current, like every culture. That's sort of what it does. It brings you up to a certain point, and then it throws you out and says, now you figure out who you are.
Yeah. So I got really interested in like indigenous like vision quest rites, like which going out into the wild,
like a walkabout.
I don't know much about it. Just going out, like, I don't know, like certain tribes going out into the desert on your own as a young man, and the idea is like you're not fully part of the community until you've had that dream, like, until you've been initiated and received what some tribes call like a big dream. And I thought that was like, I think I got to there from like Jung and stuff, but I think that's like really, really deep perception there. Like there is a sense in which we need that our own dreams, we need to develop our imagination, like and really be able to dream, to envision, and to imagine. And I think there's not a huge amount of resources for that in the culture, and I don't know necessarily that. Well, I don't know. Like it's like traditionally, like the liberal arts, like the whole point of that is for you to cultivate yourself and cultivate virtues and cultivate like music is one of the classical liberal arts, like a geometry, like mathematics, like rhetoric, the ability to speak, like all of these things are the cultivation of the soul. That's kind of the ideal, I suppose, of education.
But you actually went through the whole process of going to university and stuff, and it was after that you started that you kind of hit the void. You hit the bottom of your universe and was like, oh wait, there's nothing under here.
Yeah, well, it's part of it is dowsing, right? Like a lot of I studied philosophy as well.
What is that? Dowsing?
Oh, doubting.
Doubting. Oh, sorry.
No, but like I studied philosophy, and like we were just really encouraged to doubt paradigms, just a question, right? It's a question, and there's a positive element to that, but there's also an undermining effect of that. Like there's a way in which that undermines the integrity of our narratives and our belief systems, undermines our faith, I guess. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that was my experience, but there was also like nothing. There's a lot of like doubt and criticism in the academia, but not a lot of like positive visioning, dreaming. Jordan Peterson had a conversation with Roger Scruton, which talks about like apprehending the transcendent, and I think they really strike a note in that talk, which I really resonate with, about the way in which they're like, it's kind of like a call to envision what is good, true, and beautiful, like what is transcendent, and to kind of like call those forms into existence through the way we are. And I think, I don't know, I was never encouraged to do that at any point during my education.
Right. It was just ask questions. Like it wasn't try to conceive of answers or try to like yeah. And that's fundamentally, I feel like the philosophy that I was sort of handed by our collective culture in the West as well. It's just like there's no end to the questions you can ask, except there sort of was. Once you've kind of doubted the very nature of existence itself, you've asked the last question, and you've taken the whole bottom out of your reality, and you said, okay, well, I mean, that was my sort of experience, anyways. With it, I'm sorry if I'm reading my story too much onto yours, but I think I had a very similar experience with just kind of getting to the bottom of the questions and then realizing I have to actually begin to believe an answer, whether I can come up with a good enough one or not. This is really, there's a lot of pressure here because if I want to believe anything, I'm going to have to be willing to believe something, and I might be wrong.
Yeah. So a big figure for me was Søren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, like Danish.
Yeah.
Kind of like Christian existentialism. And
Did you read a bit of his stuff?
I read I did a bit of it at university, and one of the things that really stuck with me was like one of his early journal entries, where he took this amazing piece, and he talks about how what good would it do me to know what the objective truth even was, what good would it do me to have accumulated all of this knowledge if I did not know what was true for me. And he had this kind of idea of subjectivity as truth. If I don't know what the idea is for which I'm willing to live and die, what good is all of the knowledge in the world? What good would it be to apprehend truth in the cultural sense if that was lacking? And he wrote that in his early 20s, about the same time I was reading him. And it was just this amazing coincidence.
So it's what good would the cohesive entity of the song be without the individual pieces creating harmony?
It's a good way of putting it. Yeah. yeah.
Like the individuality. Sorry, I just extrapolated here, but continue though. This is really good. Sorry.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
I listened to one of his books. I think I listened to the Sickness Unto Death, and I didn't even understand what was going on half of the time. But it was this sort of almost trippy experience of just. But it was depressing for me because I couldn't quite follow any solution he came to. I just felt the breakdown of things happening as he's kind of unpacking and asking these questions.
Death is a big theme for Kierkegaard. I think his name actually means graveyard or something.
You go with the logos things, or the logoi. Your name, the word that identifies you, sort of creates you a little bit.
Yeah. So that's a big theme for him. But he's a super interesting figure. He was really formative for me. So I think that's really shaped my thinking through the whole of my 20s. That meditation from Kierkegaard. What good would it do me to acquire any of that knowledge, other than if I don't know what's true for me? And so I guess I'm still on that journey, and I guess I moved. I don't know. I guess I don't know why, but there was a kind of anything but Christian thing in me as I explored. I was okay, start with meditation, got really into Zen, Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, New Age, just New Age kind of paradigms, drawing. I like Aldous Huxley's idea, the idea of the perennial philosophy, that all religions contain a fragment of truth.
Right.
So all of those, I guess I moved through those stories and paradigms. I guess ultimately I found them all lacking, and it's hard to say exactly in what way, but I guess I don't know if I could find a home in any of them or something like that. It's hard for me to articulate. I don't know if I could find a home in any one of them, or whether they were a story I could fully inhabit and participate in. I guess that's the best language I have for it. There's interesting insights I learned from a lot of them, but could I participate in that story in the depth, and could that really, yeah. And I guess the musical metaphor is perfect again here, because like it's like if I am a violin and like the world's a symphony, like can I really, like, can my logos share in the greater logos of the symphony? Like, can I participate fully in the fullness of being? So I guess that's how I've come to Christianity. I think I've missed some things probably, but I just yeah. And something Jonathan Pajot said like was like quite helpful with me. It was like that you kind of have to be participating in one story, but you have to be incarnating and living and walking through a particular narrative and a particular story. And part of the problem with a lot of New Age spirituality is that you're not in any one story. Actually, you're just outside all of the stories and just like picking off the fruits of the world's spiritual traditions and just having a bank on them. Like, it's not really, where are you at that point, right? You're not.
You become just a consumer of religion rather than a participant in the larger structure of reality or whatever.
Exactly. And you're not really within a religion. You're actually outside of it. You know, like because you're the one that's looking at Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and judging them all. So, like, what perspective do you inhabit? Is the question Jonathan Pajot asked, and I thought that was really great. And then that loops to something you said. You know, that thing you said about church and language. How if people speak different languages, like our religion is akin to our language in that way. Like, we have to have a particular dialect in which we speak to say anything concrete and definite. And so we have to adopt a particular story.
You have to incarnate. I love that word, like thinking about it in terms of the Christian, story of the incarnation. It's like taking a higher concept and incarnating it down into a lower realm. So it's still sort of the same thing, but it's it's become submitted to a lower or a more subjective experience or something like that.
Yeah, right. Incarnation, yeah.
But do you have any, I mean, I don't know if this is a weird question, but like, do you ever have any of a sense of that, like maybe the reason you gravitate towards Christianity, and this is a question I've struggled with at times, but like, was the only reason you had to settle on Christianity because that was the only one pragmatically you could participate in, given where you were in the world and the culture around you, and the access to religion actually existing and those communities actually existing?
It's interesting because like that's definitely a part of it, but I don't think that's the central spirit. Like for me, it's like my heart was prepared for Christianity for several years. Like living in what was called sin in tradition, I was kind of just living in sin, and like I didn't know, hadn't call it that. Just thought I could just be me, like just live how I want to live, and ultimately, like the telos or like the end of that story was spiritually unfulfilling. We could say, like it didn't lead anywhere. And so, what do I do at that point? Do I just continue and just kind of nihilistically accept that is what it is? Or do I kind of reflect and see if there are other ways to be? That of course there are. Like I read like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, some Stoic stuff, like ideas about virtue and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, like, lots of ancient people thought about this idea of morality. Like there's a lot of people who took quite seriously the idea that there are kind of like right ways and wrong ways to live. And these ways I'm living are failing in certain ways. And so it's born of a kind of reflection on that in my own heart, I think. And then eventually I realized, like, finding the idea of the seven deadly sins was that just really connected for me, like really, really deeply connected for me. Like, I was like, oh wow, like there's this whole theological tradition describing exactly the sinful nature of human beings and like how that's overcome. And
sort of like telling you what you already had a sense of, or like, I mean, Peterson talks about the idea of like he feels like when he's speaking truth, he's not really revealing, or he's not really telling somebody anything that they didn't know. It's like if it feels true, it's probably because intuitively, you said like the idea of like your heart being prepared for something, and then it's like there's something welling up, and then suddenly somebody gives form to it. Somebody gives you a logos to actually fit that potentiality into. It's like, oh, that's exactly what I've been feeling, and now I can hold it, and it's become a thing, and it's like this negative stuff that I didn't want. Now I can actually see, oh, the seven deadly sins. Now I actually have a way of categorizing it, and I can see it, and it's become a particular thing.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it. That's such a good way of putting it. And I really, the more I look at Christianity, I actually see Jesus as what you just described there, like the eschatological or metaphysical height or pinnacle of that exact thing you just described. Like in all the ancient stories, all of these ways in which human beings were like participating in something that they couldn't quite, that didn't quite have an incarnate logos, or like wasn't like revealed in a certain way. So like that same pattern in my own life about things clicking basically, and it is like a pattern of revelation. Like it is the veil from my eyes being fallen, and like a revelation comes, like all this way I was living, like there's a way of understanding what that is. Yeah, so I mean that's heart being prepared, I think, was a big one for me. Like by the churches we have here in England, by our history. You can't really understand our history in England without understanding Christianity. You can't understand what these buildings are, and these beautiful buildings are. You can't understand, like, well, you can understand it, but like the Lord of the Rings is really formative for me. Like that story has always had a special place in my heart.
What sort of insight? I mean, I obviously I find Tolkien's whole universe to be really, really inspiring and meaningful as well. But what kind of landed about those stories that helped you to process? You know, you said like the buildings around you and like the meaning of all of that.
They're just beautiful. Like to put it simply, like really, I think beauty is such a powerful thing. Like it's just because what it does is it just quiets the searching mind, doesn't it? You know, when you're in the presence of beauty, like the intellectual and rational stuff just has to be silent and humble before it because it's just so amazing. So I mean, that really, like, just Tolkien's world is very enchanting, rich, beautiful. Basically, the best story told in popular culture.
Yeah.
Recently, you know, in the zeitgeist, I guess. I think there's a greater story, which is the Christian story, but
it's interesting that the culture is sort of willing to accept Tolkien's universe, where we've kind of, it's maybe that we haven't sort of discovered totally that it's Christian. It's like if somebody were to outright say it, then they'd be like, oh, well, we don't want that anymore. But because it's kind of maintained this anonymity or this sort of like it's a covert operation of telling this incredible story about beauty and higher meaning.
So let's talk about that, because I've heard you say that some of your background is like evangelical.
Yeah.
Something that so evangelism means like spreading the good news, right?
Yes.
And so something that's really, really interested me, and I wonder what your perspective on this is like basically what I understand as like the hiddenness of God. Or what did you say? You said covert. And so for me, the Lord of the Rings, at the heart of that is the hiddenness of God, like the mystery of God. And it's covert. It's like under the radar in some sense. And I think the same is true with the churches. Like, it's more obvious in a church, but like, even so, just like, or in music, right? So I really have this deep conviction that what is beautiful does speak of the transcendent. It speaks of the nature of God. And so, but there's something about it that I think truly evangelizes, like beauty truly evangelizes. But it's not in the way I'd typically understood evangelism, because when I listen to, say, Richard Dawkins debating evangelists or Louis Theroux doing documentaries, I had this different image of what evangelism is, right? And it's something I'm still trying to work out, but it's kind of the difference between saying, like, I don't know. Because obviously...
I think one of the things that my tradition has sort of struggled with is I think we kind of fell prey to the same strategies of kind of a rationalism or it's hard. I haven't quite found the right word for the movement, but I mean, essentially the Enlightenment, which to me seems like the entrance into one of the darkest periods of humanity in certain senses, is like the Enlightenment is almost this moment where we suddenly decided we could just do it for ourselves, and we actually don't need we don't need the higher forces to stay in the dark. We can actually just create them ourselves, or something like that. And so the idea of evangelism, or at least the evangelical tradition, and the way that I've even seen it play out, is that it kind of lost sight of the transcendence of beauty and of God, and it kind of distilled spreading the good news down to a something that's really gamified, something very particular in its strategy and very particular when it's trying to get you to do, which is to basically be able to read this prayer, the sinner's prayer, and say, yep, that applies to me, check your name on the box, and basically sign a contract, which contract is sort of like it's like a pragmatic version of relationship. It's relationship stripped of everything that makes it mysterious. A contract distills the relationship down to something that's on paper, and you can see this is exactly what this relationship entails, and these are the expectations, and this is what it is. Right? But actual relationship isn't built fundamentally on contracts. Relationship is built on the mystery and the give and take of wondering about. It's like you don't even know what sort of the other person would be willing to give up for you, or what you would be willing to give up for the other person. It's this like, and that mystery is partially what's exciting about it, but it's also what allows it to be something bigger than maybe it even is. It's like, it's hard to even describe, but like the magic of real love and a real loving relationship is that it's not explicitly this thing that's on a contract. It's like even the idea of marriage being a contract, that's a very low view of marriage. And then from that, you get this very low view of the preservation of marriage. It's like you can just throw away a marriage. You just got to avoid the contract. It's like that's not what marriage is. Marriage, the contract is just some way to make your marriage play the game of the legal system and be able to, it's translating that very abstract, very big idea of relationship into a little document, so that way you can put it into the stacks of papers that are the system of, I don't know, systematizing things. But so when
it's connected. Sorry.
No, sure, go for it.
Which is connected to something we were discussing earlier, right? You know, about disenchantment and rationalization and the way in which
exactly, yeah,
magic's being like broken down into the smallest pieces or something.
But yeah, so I mean that's as far as the version of evangelism that we were doing, and I don't mean to totally, because obviously it wasn't totally ineffective. Evangelicals have been able to spread Christianity in effective way. I mean, Billy Graham is connected with the evangelical tradition, and like obviously he's even outside of, like, his name isn't just like a household name among evangelicals. People know who Billy Graham is because he did something meaningful. He was able to pack stadiums full of people that they could like feel something meaningful he was talking about. But there was something that was creeping in through that tradition, and I really don't feel like it was unique to Christianity at all or the evangelicals. But this gamification of Christianity crept in. That's what I want to call it, anyways. And
so, what do you mean gamification? So, like, kind of trying to get the win. You mean like trying to?
Yeah, well, it comes down to this tension I find between, and this is something I've been thinking about a little bit, is about the difference between games and stories. And so the difference to me, and I think I might be able to lay this out a little bit better. We were talking about this in our first talk I did kind of to do with this project. And I think I've got a little bit further in processing this problem. But so I think the difference is that a game what they have in common, maybe I should say first of all, is that the games and stories both sort of distill reality down to like one particular metric, right? They bring it down to like, or maybe a couple, but it's like you at least get one telos of value. Okay, this is where we're going, and this is what we're trying to go away from.
Okay.
Right. And so within a game, that is based on very mathematical systems of a score and of fouls and of of deaths. I mean, if you look at your stats on a video game and see how long you've been playing and what you've accomplished and what percentage you've made it, right? It's like those are very particular things, and we kind of agree within a game that those represent your progress in the game. There's something beyond that though, because people, especially gamers who review games, they talk about like, it's like, okay, there's different even styles of playing video games, because games can be about having fun in a game. And it's like you see somebody playing Grand Theft Auto 5, it's not about like 100%ing the game. It's about like all the crazy things you could do in that game engine, right? Or within Minecraft, it's not about winning, right? It's about something else. There's certainly like more storyfied games, but like generally speaking, we can think about that general concept of a game as having more to do with a particular score, and we can distill the system down to that. But then when it comes to a story, everything gets a little bit more abstract, and it's like a story. It almost intrinsically has to do with beauty, or it has to do with these abstract forms, things we're kind of almost talking about. But like a story, even though we distill it down to a particular narrative, and you're going somewhere, there's still that linearity to it, and a telos sort of associated to it, right? Where it's like you're trying to get from here to here. So we do have a sense of like what it means to get through the story and to get to the end, but it's cohering a whole bunch of. It's just basically the difference is just an abstract sense of progress versus a very particular sense of progress.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think there's something about stories where they unfold, and like a good story, you don't necessarily know the end, right? But yeah, you're right. They do. I guess the meaning of the story, like comedy and tragedy, that is kind of defined by its telos, by where it ends up. Yeah.
So, I think in both cases, it's sort of a yin yang thing. That I think there's traces of story that show up in video games, and probably the better the game is, the more it will kind of encapsulate that element as well. But then a story, again, it feels totally incoherent unless there's sort of a system of a system of progress, or kind of a gamification of it a little bit too. It's just that if we stray too far to either one of those ends, well, that's fundamentally what I feel like. I keep on thinking about it in terms of capitalism, but I'm not sure if that's quite what it is. But it's just the inclination to want to like fit all of the story of the story of religion into a particular metric where we can at least say when we've scored a goal, right? We can say that when we've got a convert, and I don't know if this actually started with Billy Graham, but at least he was somebody who sort of popularized the idea of like, how many converts did we get at that conference, right? And we could write it down because we know how many people prayed the prayer. People do the questionnaire, and then we can put it in data, right? So that's what I'm talking about as far as the game. Right? Yeah.
It's a movement from quality to quantity. It's like the opposite of the thing
Yeah.
It is, isn't it? Like, yeah, it's the opposite of the process we were just talking about, because we're trying to quantify, aren't we?
Right.
Like, and it's I totally hear what you're saying. Have you heard Jordan Peterson talk about this? He has a big thing about games, and he talks about it's not about the game; it's about constantly improving at the game. And like he talks about the heroic pattern as like the pattern which is constantly striving to improve at games.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting too. That draws out something about this relationship, because it's almost, I don't know if I want to call it an idolatry or something, but like if I'm in a football game right now and like my only sense of identity is bound up with winning this game now, then I lose sense of the bigger picture, don't I? Like, or the bigger story of playing football across my life or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So in order, and this is so interesting. So I mean, one of the first people that actually helped me to really click and see that process, surprisingly, is Richard Dawkins. Because I listened to his book on Audible. I listened to The Selfish Gene. And honestly, it's so funny listening to that book, growing up in a very, very Christian home, and then suddenly, it's almost like what he was trying to do was to sort of unpack religion and explain why it was dumb and disenchant the world. But that book, the experience of reading that book was so enchanting to me because it was my first exposure to the beauty of the story of evolution. Dawkins was the one who introduced me to the computers playing the prisoner's dilemma problem. So there's all these different programmers. I think it even used to be sort of like an annual game where different programmers would get together and test out their solutions to the prisoner's dilemma problem against each other and see which ones would win. But the game, like as far as what would win, when you're just playing one round of the game, when you're just trying to figure out the answer to the prisoner's dilemma, the answer isn't obvious. Just tattle on the other prisoner. Which, if anybody, obviously, if you don't, are you familiar with this kind of philosophical problem or this little game?
The prisoner's dilemma. Yeah, I think so. But
it's basically it's like if you have two prisoners and you're questioning them in different rooms, you offer them both a reward to tattle on the other, but you don't have evidence to book either one of them. But if they both confess, then they're both going in jail. If neither of them confess, they both are at least going free. But if one of them confesses, he's going free and he's getting a wad of cash. Right? And so the obvious answer in that problem is to tattle on the other prisoner, because either he's going to sell you out and you're going to do nothing, and he's not only is he going to go free, he's going to get money, or you don't, or so either you win or you win big time, or you at least don't do worse than the other guy. Those are the three outcomes of if you choose to. So the only way that you both are not having a net loss is if both of you don't sell the other person out, but then nobody gets any great gains from the situation, right? And so I think it's like everybody's trying to solve this problem. It's like this game. How do we solve this game? What's the best way to win this? I don't even know why it became so popular, but I guess people were just interested in that. It's like, okay, what's the solution to this problem? But the strategies for winning that game drastically changed as soon as it became an iterative game. So as soon as you're not just playing it once, but you're playing it over and over and over and over again, ad infinitum, then the strategy that's the most effective becomes so much more complex and so much more interesting. And that's what sparked this whole, now we can actually make this an event every year of who's going to win this game, because we actually don't, it's not an obvious answer anymore. We actually have to figure out, is it tit for tat? That was one of the best algorithms to run the game, which was, don't do anything, but if the other guy sells you out, sell him out next time, or something like that. But then there was another one that was a little bit better later on, where it was like, okay, well, sell him out sometimes, but kind of randomly. But then also, if he sells you out, sell him out right back. And it's like there's all these different little interesting things. But it's just like, as soon as you realize that you're not just playing one game, you have to understand a meta understanding of strategy.
Yeah, right. So that's like a story, isn't it? Like you've got to account for time now.
Yeah.
You've got to account for time.
But not only that, is like, so if there's, I think that strategy even changes a bit depending on whether or not it's an infinite set of games versus if there is, because if you know when the end happens, if you know the last game is coming up, on the last game, you're going to play for sure, sell the other guy out, because that's your best bet at getting something, right? But if you never know when the end is, if the game that you're playing is an infinite game, if you have a sense of the afterlife,
that's
right?
That's really interesting.
then your strategy becomes always, I don't know, it at least makes the question a little bit more difficult again. It's like, that's what religion does. It pokes holes in our strategies with closed systems of games, and it says, okay, but what do you do if the game goes on forever? What do you do? How do you conceptualize, what the best strategy is?
Was this Richard Dawkins' argument?
Yes. Well, he doesn't go so far as to talk about the afterlife, but he just talks about how strategy changes once the game is iterative. And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, so that's why Christians believe in an afterlife, or like that's why that's such a meaningful idea.
Wow, that's so insightful.
That's what I'm saying. It's so funny reading this book and having him sort of, and every time he would go on a little tirade about how much he hated religion, I was like, oh, this is adorable, Richard. You're defending my beliefs better than I ever could by trying to say that you think they're dumb.
Have you ever heard much from Tom Holland, the historian?
No, I've heard Paul Vanderklay talk a little bit about him. I've been meaning to give him his due, but I should box in though what I just said about Richard Dawkins. He's definitely way smarter than me, and that was my experience of reading his work, anyways.
No, Tom Holland's comment on Richard Dawkins is that he's got a thoroughly evangelical spirit.
That's great. In the same sense that I was sort of describing evangelicalism, where it's like trying to gamify things, or what do you mean?
Well, just like Tom Holland's whole thesis is that like we cannot help but be Christian. Like in the West, like if you really deeply understand our history, all our ancestors were Christian. Like we're so deeply formed in a Christian image that we're swimming in that water, right? And he traces the story about atheism, how it emerges. I think he traces it to like the papal reformations and like 12th century or something. I think, what is it? So I think the church start to reform, like the papacy starts to reform in the 12th century, like the moral integrity of the clergy or something like that. And they're like, had these issues about how the moral integrity of the clergy. And that starts this first like impulse of reformation. Like, Christendom could be improved. And then, like through the centuries,
sorry, I'm really unfamiliar with a lot of what happened, kind of all in between Christ and then current moments. But so wait, what happened in the 12th century?
So I'll try to do my best to Tom Holland's argument. This is from his book Dominion. And I'm not a historian, and I'm learning through this stuff through reading him in different books. So they're called like the papal reforms. So I think it's the 12th century, you get basically noises within the papacy, within the church in Rome, saying that basically calling for like the improvement of the moral integrity and the character of the clergy, of the priests.
Okay.
And that's called, I think they're called the Gregorian reforms. And basically the big narrative of Tom Holland and the interesting point is like you get in there like the seeds of reformation, right? Like the seeds of reformation within Christendom. And then in the next century, there's more reformation. And then the next century, there's more. And he traces these stories throughout Europe of these different waves of reformation.
Right.
Which ultimately culminates in the Protestant Reformation.
So it seems that the Protestant Reformation is one of a totally different kind, because it's a, or maybe not a totally different kind, but it's something that branches off or splits off rather than reforming the whole, or like.
Well, that's what I was going to get to atheism, right? Because I'm trying to get to. Okay. We were talking about Dawkins, and for Tom Holland, it's all actually in the same kind of historical story in a way, and I think he traces it to the writings of St. Paul. He's really, really interesting. Recommended to check out. So he sees like these impulses of reformation throughout the Christian spirit, basically, and how like the Protestant Reformation is like an example, part of that impulse, but part of a broader story. And then, once the Reformation gets going, then you get questions like, if all of these other gods are untrue, then is our God true? Like, and that's like the birth of atheism. Like, and it's the same kind of like critique that Christendom had been doing. He traces it to what was it? Charlemagne in France, thinking like the 9th century or something, early 9th century. Charlemagne like purging Francia, like his empire of like the pagan the pagan lands in the east, and that thing of like saying, oh, these are false gods, like the Christian God is the true God, and like these are false. And that impulse was there hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and then it just develops, and then you get I think it's Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century, whose early kind of enlightenment starts with the atheist noises, where it's just saying like, oh, well, if we've said that about every other god, then
and now we're gonna
what about
do it with the
what about us?
Well, the thing that I almost want to like, so I don't know where you were going to say as far as with Dawkins. Are we caught up here?
Well, it's that he's imbibing a Protestant spirit and he's spreading a good news. Like he's spreading a light, a truth. He wants people to wake up.
Breaking the shackles of this current, sort of oppressive tradition of, and that's always what you can kind of see as a false god, or it's like it's a way of conceptualizing God that isn't true enough anymore. But the thing about it makes sense to me that we're still struggling with this, because it's just basically it's one of the easiest traps to fall into, is you're just getting stuck in a rut. But like within Christianity, even the way we celebrate it in our traditions and our stories and our holidays, we kill our God every year. We have a death and resurrection ceremony. We tell that story every year, and we're supposed to enter into that story and let our God die and become resurrected and get that new light and see the resurrection of Christ in our lives. But we miss that. We get, I don't know why. I mean, I guess I do know why, because it's just so easy to do, but it's like we have a constant reminder there that that's the way Christianity is, ought to be lived out.
Through death and rebirth, you mean?
Yeah, well, it's a reformation. We call it being born again, but like Christ is the figure of God, right? And we tell the story of Christ dying and resurrecting every year, and I personally believe that the part of the significance of telling that story every year is to remind ourselves of that experience of entering into the death of our conception about God and allowing him to know. Allowing sort of a reformed understanding of God, a reformation every year,
Yeah, I really like that way of thinking of it. I think it strikes at something very true, right? Because we do, I don't know, we do constantly need to be renewed and to let our old values die and our old ways of perception that are flawed in different ways die off, and to be revivified. Yeah. I think that's a very fundamental pattern.
Do you see that as compatible, or that story as compatible with the alchemist tradition and their stories, or is that something that's like sort of unique to Christianity? Or I mean, Christianity and alchemism aren't totally on different wavelengths, are they?
So this is a question I've really been wrestling with, to be honest, because in my recent YouTube content, I've been delving more into Christian themes, and I've been going through a transformation, and I've been kind of like unsure about what to put out and what to even talk about, because like it's a bit of a shift between worlds in a way. But so I'm still wrestling with it, but I think there's a few touch points that bring them together for me. One is the idea of, I guess, spiritual perfection, and if you look at the best thing I could have for this in Christianity is the Orthodox concept of theosis, or the Catholic concept of divinization. I don't know if there are equivalent concepts within Protestant traditions, but the idea of basically spiritual perfection, the idea that through Jesus, through living in grace and the grace of God, like perfection and wholeness is possible, and that sin can be overcome, and our fallenness, basically our baseness, like lead baseness, like our the flaws in our character, is possible through the revelation of Christ and of God for those things to be overcome. I think that is Now, I don't know if that's necessarily correct theologically. Like, I'm still learning about these things. Like, but I do see in both stories, the alchemical story of transforming lead into gold, and the Christian story of transforming sin into virtue, or transcending our passions, transcending our sins. In both of those is a narrative of deep transformation, like and
or reformation.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe both. Yeah, maybe both. I guess.
What would be the difference? Yeah, between transformation and reformation, or at least within the way that the historical traditions associated with those words. Because I mean, you could just say that they mean the same thing, but obviously, that's a little bit conflationary.
Well, like this is what again charmed me so much about alchemy, because a butterfly is an image in nature of transformation, right? It's when one nature dies completely and is reborn in another, as another nature.
And I think, even when they do that, like within the cocoon, it literally just becomes goo.
Really?
I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it actually just
returns
amazing. To a base form of just like genetic goop, and then the DNA totally reforms itself into something else. And that's what it's like. If you break open the cocoon while it's in that transformation, in that metamorphosis, it's not anything.
So that's an alchemical idea. They call it the Prima Materia, or the prime material. So that goop you're talking about is like the ontological stuff of which everything's made, and the whole alchemical assumption is that if a thing breaks down, it goes into the Prima Materia and can be recast in the new.
It is within that tradition. Is there any sense of that the Prima Materia is sort of the same across? Because this is one of the problems I have with like trying to process spiritual ideas about meaning. Is that is it the case that any sort of potentiality is able to inhabit any form? And I know that's sort of a weird question. I might need to unpack it a little bit. But is it the case? So I mean, if you just broke down me into the goo that makes me up, could that goo within the alchemist tradition, could that be made into a rock, or is that where their intuition went? Because to me, it doesn't seem that any matter is capable of sort of manifesting into any form. Like I could see that. I mean, recently on the Lord of Spirits podcast, they brought this thought experiment about the ship of Theseus, right? The idea that like, okay, this ship continues to be, okay, maybe I should tell the whole story real quick. So it's like Theseus is this, I guess, Greek hero, right? And there's a ship that he went on all his adventures on. And after he's died, they have this ship on display, and wood begins to rot, and they gradually have to replace pieces of the wood. And the question is, once they've got to the point where they've replaced every piece of wood and there's not a single original piece of wood on it, is it still the ship of Theseus, right? And their answer to it, and this seems to be this sort of more spiritual way of looking at things, is that it still is the ship of Theseus because it's still acting as the ship of Theseus. It's embodying that particular pattern, and it's it's everybody who's interacting with it is interacting with it as the ship of Theseus. But
so that's another example of the logos, right? We were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
If you want a crystal example of it, yeah.
But so within that example, I mean, my mind kind of went wandering there. I was okay, so, but it's not the case that that any matter, any biological matter that exists out there could inhabit the form that is my wife. Only she can do that. There's only some matter that's actually capable of being embodied into that form. I mean, throughout her life, obviously her cells get replaced. I mean, this is something else they brought up on that podcast, that the idea that like your human body is made up of a whole bunch of different cells, and they're not the same cells throughout your entire life. They get entirely 100% replaced. There's not a single one that's the same every several years, right? So the idea is that
But do you know about stem cells as well? It's like they're all. I'm not a biologist, but one of the most interesting ideas learning about biology at school was the idea of like stem cells. I think all cells in our body differentiate into specific cells. It's like the pattern of manifestation of our biology comes from like stem cells, and stem cells are basically like potential cells. So like they could be anything, and then they are something.
Okay.
So I'm just throwing that into the mix.
So I think like, you can get down to the bottom of.
And like the DNA is the logos in that sense, because like the DNA is like the code or like the word telling the potential cell to form according to a particular pathway. You go and be a heart, you go and be skin cells, you go and be hair. Like, and there's like a blueprint in DNA in the nucleus.
The important thing is though that DNA couldn't reprogram a rock. You couldn't just blend up a rock and throw that stem cell into that goo and then it would form into. It's like that there's some material that is, or there's some potentiality, and I'm kind of using those words interchangeably, but that like material, matter has to do with potential. It's not a formed substance. It's like the prima materia. It's before being formed, right? And so,
well, the question is, I don't know about what you're saying, because a rock, like, what happens when something is broken down to the goop? You said, the goop. What happens when a rock is broken into the goop? What would a chemist say? What would a physicist say?
Right. Yeah,
there's a good word for it, because that is what it's like formless stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so what is it? I don't know. Atoms, hydrogen. I don't know enough about the science, but like presumably a rock and us are made of electrons. I don't know, quarks,
or even below that. Yeah, what is it like? Gluons and different.
Are you serious? Gluons.
I think that's one of the words. Yeah, but I don't know anything about that.
That's a perfect word.
Gluons. It's with the goop stuff. But
the goops and the gluons.
Maybe you might even be so. My first question though is the alchemist intuition about this? Is it that prima materia can be made into anything, or is that there's different categories of that primal material that can be like there's still limitation on it?
That's a hard question to answer. I think the prima materia is associated with the famous philosopher's stone, like, which is like arguably the telos, the goal of alchemy is the attainment of the philosopher's stone. And they just write loads of cryptic things about it, like, it is everywhere, it is above, it is below, and it is like before all of your eyes, but none of you can see it, like stuff like that. Like, all of these mystical sayings, like,
yeah.
So it's a hard one to answer. Like, I think the alchemical intuition is that ontologically the prima materia is like everywhere. You could kind of think of it like an atom or a gluon or something like that. And that's the intuition. And then the idea is that nature is already transforming. Like, that is the way of it. And this is connected to some of the Greek mysteries, the rites of Eleusis, how Demeter, the nature goddess Demeter, her daughter Persephone is snatched into Hades in autumn time for 6 months, and she weeps, and then it's autumn, or then winter, and then Persephone returning is the spring and the summer. So that's another point of connection between alchemy and
so that story is the idea of forms returning to formlessness, would be returning to their prima materia, and then they're born again. So it's again similar to the Christian story, or I mean the version of that story that I heard recently. I was listening to some a mythology book. I think it was just some guy kind of tried to simplify a lot of different mythological traditions to make them listenable. I forget the name of the book, but he was telling some of the ancient Mesopotamian myths and talked about the descent and emergence of Inanna. Right? Have you heard that story?
I haven't.
Okay. I've heard even other people kind of connect it to the story of Jonah, but I think it's one of the earliest traditions to use the idea of 3 days being the amount of time it takes to get to the underworld. But anyway, it's a similar descent story. It's just like a goddess goes down into the underworld and then comes up in some way new, some way different. Right. I think a lot of traditions even ultimately follow that character and say that there's a connection between Inanna and then Ishtar and then Isthra and then Persephone. Like, I mean, these are all. I think there's a continuity between those traditions.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, because I mean, it makes sense, right? Because we're talking about the myths and the stories, but if you just look at the phenomenological reality of it, of every human being who's lived, it's just like they live through. Literally, like the blooming and coming to life.
And you go to sleep and you wake up too. So we have a descent and emergence every single day.
Yeah. Yes, it's just the patterns to things, isn't it?
It's before
So I
your
think,
eyes, and
yeah.
you didn't even see it.
Well, okay. So this is another link to alchemy that brings me, I guess, to the symbolic world.
Mhm.
Is that is before your eyes and you didn't see it thing is kind of like the alchemists perceive like they help me understand symbolism, like help me understand what it is to have symbolic eyes and to see symbolically. Because if it's before your eyes and you don't see it, then you're just kind of unconsciously in the pattern. But when you see it, like the meaning in your life, like symbolize,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's kind of like an awakening of the soul or something, or the imagination, or that big dream idea I was talking about, where like when you have no meaning, like going out and finding a big dream and then returning to the community. Like it's there's a whole phase in alchemy. They have the lead state. It's like you could say the fallen state in Christian terms.
Mm.
The
Okay.
lead state. They have the silver state, which is like associated with the moon, and then they have like the reddening, like the solar state. So you have like lead, silver, gold is a basic kind of pattern to the process, and the silver state is they call it like the lunar dawn, and this just fascinated me because they had a word for what was happening. And they had a word for what was like happening in my soul as I was studying it. It was
Mm.
like when a symbol clicked for me, and like, I was like, whoa, like that is a deep pattern, like we just discussed, like death and rebirth.
Yeah.
Something was happening in my soul where I was seeing in a way that I'd forgotten to see, or something like that. And it's interesting too because that's kind of connected with I'm going a bit everywhere here, but that's kind of connected with the idea of the child, like because as a child you're kind of like in imagination, right? And there is a sense in which we kind of fall out of that in maturation
Right.
into kind of that process you talked about, like when what we were saying about disenchantment and stuff. Like there is a way in which we fall into materiality or something and lose that symbolic vision.
Yeah.
And part of the alchemical transformation is breaking down the fallen state and something reconstellating. And
Right.
what reconstellates is first the imagination, or like the symbolic vision. And yeah, so I mean that, and then so yeah, and then I looked at Tolkien, who's a really important figure for me, who had used his imagination to evangelize in basically the most profound way that I had seen.
Okay.
So I was like, oh wow, like there's Christian traditions that are onto this, but in yeah, I guess I find Tolkien more compelling than Jung now, but Jung was one of the most profound people I'd ever read and had a real sensitivity for the
Yeah.
imagination. But what did Tolkien do? He really did enchant, like he really fully
But
constellated the pattern or something.
one of the ways of doing that, though, I think that, or maybe a key difference, though, to the way that Tolkien does it versus the way that evangelicals have done it, is that Tolkien, again, he does that. It does that hidden thing where he brings all reality into this coherence of this grand narrative and sort of makes sense of things. And he doesn't tell you he's doing that. He doesn't, like, people
That's
read The Lord
difference.
of the Rings and they don't. He says that this is a fictional story. It's presented as the fictional section, and so it catches you off guard how true it feels, because it doesn't. It's almost like a friend recently the other day was telling me this. There's the parable or the advice Jesus gives, like don't sit at the top of the table, sit at the bottom, and then you will be, brought up. If you sit too close to the head of the table, then whoever the host will come and take you and put you at the foot of the table. And it's like, if you present yourself as lowly, it's like, yeah, it's something. It's like Tolkien presented his story as something. This is just a story. Anybody can have this. And then on its own, it reached into the soul of everybody and elevated to this. No, this is beyond true.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating. I'm with you so much there. It's such a fascinating story because Tolkien. I had to find out that he was a devout Catholic. Like I didn't.
Yeah.
I had to find out, and then there's something else with Lewis as well. Like there's something going on with the Inklings, like with that little group. Like there's something profound going on, and Lewis. I think it's Michael Ward, who wrote a book called the Narnia Code, and I've seen like a few of his lectures. Okay. And his basic thesis is really interesting, but he kind of like decoded Lewis's Narnia stories, like the seven, as corresponding to the astrological seven heavens of the medieval vision.
Great.
And so like each book is like there's like one that's Jupiter, and one that's the moon, like all of these different ones.
Okay, yeah. Can you walk me through that real quick? Because that's not a I hadn't heard of that before. So there's an astrological tradition about there being seven heavens.
So this is kind of connected to like the alchemical visions and stuff, right? But it's so like we're on Earth. It's seven heavens. What are they? So you've got like the moon and the sun, Mars and Venus, Mercury. Mercury we mentioned earlier. Well, the Romans called him Mercury. That's Hermes, the Greek Hermes.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so you'll get it now with alchemy because it's connected to astrology and the above and the below and the influence of these energies. Anyway.
Mercury isn't right at the middle, though. Mercury is like 2 steps away from the sun, or.
The medieval vision's different to like our.
Oh, interesting.
The literal.
Okay. Yeah, do you know how the ordering are? Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, is Mercury the central figure, like right in the center of the structure, to sort of mediate between the two depths?
Yeah, I mean, I know that Saturn's at the edge. So, I mean, I'm going to go all over the place a bit here, but so you've got lunar, solar, like moon, sun, Mercury, Venus is a kind of sexuality and eros.
Right. Yeah.
Mars is like war and aggression.
Yeah.
Moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They're the seven. I don't know if I've got the order right, but I'll have to look it up afterwards. But like Saturn is the image of like what is at the outermost edge of all things.
That's so funny. As you're saying that, I'm totally got lost for a second because I'm trying to think about this in terms of this 20th century like vision of the planets, and I'm like, you missed Earth. But to them, the the Earth wasn't the same thing. It's like these are different divine entities, and the Earth is we're just down here. We're in this little dome, and we're observing these gods in the heavens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like there's the terrestrial plane, and then the celestial, and the heavens are
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you though.
It's okay, but I'll try and stay on Lewis because this takes us off into so many really interesting areas. But like that's like old astrological knowledge, and that is connected to alchemy. So you can think of alchemy as like the terrestrial equivalent of astrology. Astrology looks to the heavens. Alchemy looks to the transformations of Earth, like the mineral metals, the transformation of nature here below, and then astrology is looking above. But so yeah, like this scholar Michael Ward, I really recommend it if you're into Lewis. It's an amazing like talk. But he's basically written a book decoding this idea that the seven heavens of the medieval cosmology, which were discarded. He wrote a book called The Discarded Image.
Oh, he's the same author of that book. That's been kind of entering into my spheres recently too. I that's on my book list anyways. I got to read it at some point.
Same, yeah. I haven't got to it yet. But like, so that image I just described of the seven heavens was discarded for Lewis. But anyway, so Michael Ward's thesis is that each book in Narnia has as its secret soul, you could say, like each of these seven heavens. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because it's the same pattern as Tolkien. It's like it took this. Firstly, that's not obvious from the stories at all.
Right.
And the scholar's just like, I was always like puzzled to figure out like what like the coherence was, or like what to make sense of the Narnia stories. And he did all this research, and that's his thesis. Is that's the hidden key to it. And again, the reason I'm telling the story is because Lewis was doing what he told no one about this. Yeah. Some scholar had to, decades later, really investigate it.
And because you don't get the. So what's the important thing about doing that? It's that like you don't get the credit of having evangelized that concept. You just do it and you let it be, right? When you explain it, then you kind of take away the people's experience of the journey of coming to have that aha. Maybe that's part of it, anyways.
So something just clicked as you were talking. So in medieval interpretations like Dante, we had the idea of like the literal reading of scripture, the moral reading of scripture, the allegorical, and the fourth one is called the anagogical.
Okay.
And I don't fully understand what that means, but
I was just going to say, I've heard that word a couple times, but I have no idea what it means.
So as you were speaking, something clicked.
Okay.
There's just an intuition, I guess, but it means in Greek like a climb or an ascent, and kind of like Plato's cave, like leaving the cave, like a movement. And so what I really think it might be with Tolkien and Lewis is anagoge, like which is really in some medieval, because they were both really well read in medieval literature. But anagoge is the way in which a story moves you. Like, that's, I guess, the best way I can put it. But like in the same way that we're moved to one day discover that about Tolkien or Lewis, and it's actually a movement of our heart and our soul to it's love, like it's the kindling of love. So maybe that's it, because I think
and here's the crazy thing that I'm just noticing right now as we're thinking about this is that so if Lewis or Tolkien had have described their process and basically threw off the curtain behind the magic trick, well, that's what it becomes, a magic trick rather than an experience of this transcendental knowledge. Because as soon as you tell somebody the interpretation of a piece of art or a song as if it's the interpretation, and that's one of probably the biggest mistakes. So it's like, even though Lewis may have been inspired by this seven heavens pattern, there's something even deeper that pattern is getting at, right? And it's like, but if you can just kind of tell somebody, oh, well, we've actually cracked the code, and the code is just seven heavens, you suddenly get this get out of jail free card that you're no longer bear the weight of that mystery. It's just, oh, well, it's solved. I can move on from that thing and I can go on to the next thing. Engagement is something that demands your attention and demands you enter into it. And it's like, you may still have to manifest it, or you still may have to kind of cut it up into a particular pattern. But even
the mystery is preserved.
Pardon? Yeah, the mystery is sort of preserved. Because you realize how difficult it was to come there, and you know all the steps that all the information you ignored to kind of fit it into that pattern, and you realize that there's something still so much deeper than that, but that's maybe as far as you're going to go in that moment, or at least that's one way of making sense of it. But if you just look at somebody else and they say, okay, this is how you make sense of it, you're not forced to recognize that that's not all that there is. Right?
That's really perceptive. And the way we grow up from children, part of that fall, and this is connected to the alchemical idea of like Saturn, like how our consciousness becomes lead-like, is just literally what you said. It's like, if you give someone a code, if I tell you before you see a film, oh, like this is how you interpret that film.
Yeah.
That is what happens in maturation, isn't it? Like as we grow, we experience novel situations, and now we just go, when I X, that's that. Yeah. And that's what our knowledge is, isn't it? Like it's
a pattern. Yeah.
And so that whole edifice.
It's the same idea of intelligence, right? Or at least the one you were talking about, this sort of ancient understanding of intelligence, right? Of being able to perceive certain forms or something like that.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm getting at is that Jesus said something about having eyes but not being able to see, and the child sees in a fully open way the transcendent as it reveals itself.
Yeah.
And as we mature, memory or habit or knowledge or something kind of accumulates, and then we just don't. How can we see the same thing with the same eyes again? Unless a piece of art, unless our imagination. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, if we've experienced something 100 times, we have kind of a instant gut reaction model for what that thing is.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which our imagination and our eyes
yeah.
are diminished in their perception, and we have eyes, but we're not able to see.
Yeah.
And part of it, I think, the magic of Lewis and Tolkien's work is that it's taking these eyes that can't see and kind of helping us see again in a way.
Because they haven't given us that little trick or that little skip to just say, oh, this is just the pattern of Christianity. If you do that, you don't even bother reading the Lord of the Rings. You're just like, oh, it's an analogy about Christianity. Okay, I get it. I already get it. It's done. But if you never say that, and especially if like both of them, you continue to resist it your entire life, and you say, no, you don't get to do that. That's not what this work is. This work is something referencing some mystery, something beautiful that can only be experienced. And after you've experienced it, you might want to formulate your experience in a particular way. Maybe that's fine, but the story you tell about the experience you had with it is not the experience itself. In the same way that those stories that they're telling aren't even the thing that they're referencing in themselves. It's like, but you have to experience those stories to realize that those stories are about some deep experience of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we're speaking, it makes me think about the pattern of going to church as well, engaging in sacraments. And if you think of what Jonathan Pajot says as church as a mountain, and anagoge meaning climbing or ascent, there's a way in which those stories help us ascend, but also it's the same thing of what you said, because it's at the heart of it all is a mystery, in the deepest sense, an infinitely receding mystery. And our climb towards that, our ascent towards that, and our movement towards that in love, for me, that is the Christian pattern. But yeah, there's real limitations to just saying that. It's a participation, it's a dance, it is deeply a story. It's like a story, a myth. It's something that moves us. And this connects to this, what we talked about of telos, our aim. The value of a story is the way it moves us, where we go with that. I don't know, that's what I get from reflecting on Lewis and Tolkien's work. Because,
It's good, man. I'm just thinking about where to go from here. I think we've unpacked some, or we've dipped our toes into some very deep waters, and I think I'm going to need some time to continue to let this stuff process in my brain. And I think I don't know about how you're feeling, but I feel effectively reduced to a prima materia here, and I need to let myself reform.
Yeah, I've become a gluon.
Good stuff.
Yeah, no, cool. Yeah, I feel like we've been talking for a couple of hours. Yeah, I feel like that was a beautiful discussion. I really enjoyed that, and I really Lewis and Tolkien I've been a big fan of their work for a while, and it's been good to reflect.
Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Any kind of engagement really helps out with algorithm stuff as far as I'm aware. Another thing I'd love if you would do would be to share this video with someone who you think might find it interesting, or specifically might disagree with it about something, or disagree with you about something, and use it as a launch pad to have an interesting conversation, have an interesting disagreement, maybe. Because that's really what this whole thing is about for me. I think that having honest disagreements is a really useful and meaningful thing to do. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.